Thank you, everyone. Thanks to IASA for giving us the hour. I think this is going to be quite different, perhaps, from some of the other conversations that have been happening so far. As we were introduced, the slot here we're talking about is conscious architectural choices. In other words, making architectural decisions and choices that have business impact and have technology impact and wider impact consciously, rather than sort of essentially sleepwalking into some of the things that can result off the back of architecture. So look, just before we kind of get into that, this talk is part of the Architect Tomorrow community, so part of the Architect Tomorrow kind of group. And I just wanted to say that if you enjoy this and you want to know more about the speakers, we'll have videos on all the panelists very shortly. We've got most of us already on the YouTube channel here, where the link is here. So if you go to YouTube and search for Architect Tomorrow, or you go to LinkedIn and search for Architect Tomorrow, you will find us on there. Feel free to continue the conversation with us, because we're going to be covering a whole range of different topics in the next best part of an hour. And I suspect it's going to raise a whole series of questions that we may not have time to get to, but we'll see how much time we have for Q&A at the end. But you can find us all at Architect Tomorrow and find videos that are related to this conversation on there. What are the considerations then, if we kind of think about the choices that architects are having to make, or the recommendations about choices that architects are making for their businesses? On this slide here is kind of the typical list, not exhaustive, but generally it's kind of looking at what are the capabilities. If you're an enterprise architect, what are the capabilities? Or if you're perhaps more a solution architect, what's the functionality that's been delivered by by a particular solution? There's a big piece, of course, about technology often, unless you're more of a business architect, and of course there is cost. Those three things, I would argue, are probably the things that are front of mind for most architects. And then on here I've got kind of the risks and compliance issues and concerns, which perhaps we'll touch on a bit more in a bit, but also the non-functional requirements. Now, non-functional requirements, are often sort of things like performance and security and all those sorts of things, which are, really important things from a technology standpoint. But if we move on to the next slide and think about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, I would actually argue, and this is what we will debate for the next rest of the hour, that there are a range of other topics that architects should be considering and bringing to their business. Whether that's around not disadvantaging certain groups of people who are the users of your platform, be that the kind of planetary kind of level issues. How is this contributing towards perhaps climate issues, or waste, ecosystems and biodiversity. There's a range of sustainable development goals here, which we'll dive into some of them. There's not enough time to do justice in all of them, but we'll pick a few and we'll kind of give some concrete examples of where we've seen businesses thinking about this and taking action. And I think the thing to think about here is, of course, this varies depending on who you are, what industry you work in, and what enterprise essentially you're kind of architecting, or what business you're working in. As I say, keep these front of mind as we kind of go through. It's very much a kind of about broadening the non-functional requirements from the kind of traditional set that folks will know into kind of the wider sustainable development goals kind of conversation. And so that before we kind of I introduce the panel, a last piece from me on this one. I think there are often, for many of these things, which are big, scary, complex issues, multi-layered problems, architectural problems, sort of structural problems, there are a number of different perspectives to look at this from, right? So there is the individual focus. What can I do as an individual about this? Which often is it feels like you're just a small cog in a very large machine. There is the kind of government and regulatory angle, which we've touched on already with kind of the compliance piece, and I'm sure we'll pick up on that. The bit I really want us to all think about, and for those of you, listening to us today, is to think about how the conscious architectural choices you make can influence the organization you work for to move the needle on this stuff. Because I think, yes, there's a certain number of things we can do individually to make choices about perhaps how we fuel our homes and our cars and other things, and perhaps our dietary choices, but it's a limited kind of range of things we can do. I would argue that if you're in an architect role, you can have a massive impact on your organization, and therefore the organization's impact on society and people. And so that's kind of why I really want to kind of raise awareness in the architect community around thinking more broadly about the planet, about society, and so on and so forth. So just going to give you a picture. Yes, of course, there's things you can do individually. There's things that governments should be doing, but this is all about the conversation we should be having with our organizers, with our organizations, with our enterprises, with the people we work for or work with as customers or part of our supply chain. And so look, I'm really pleased to be joined by a fantastic panel. I suppose I should say who I am as well. So I'm Oliver Cronk, the Chief IT Architect for Tanium, and I lead the Architect Tomorrow community, essentially kind of act as the kind of coordinator and sort of leader of that. And I'm really pleased to say we have some great speakers from a range of different industries and different roles to talk to us today. So, yes, we have Mina Frost, who comes from a pharmaceuticals kind of background, many years in pharmaceuticals, and Mina, I'm sure, will touch on that when she talks to us in a moment. Bianca and I know each other from Deloitte days, which she's now studying for an MBA in Spain, which sounds very interesting. Gunnar is the Chief Technology and Innovation Officer at Capgemini EMEA, Capgemini Europe. So Gunnar and I have previously spoken on Architect Tomorrow about sustainability in IT and the need for architects to think about energy usage and sustainability and waste and things like that. And I'm sure Gunnar and I will touch on some of those things. Nathan and I have spoken recently. We did a video about the conscious architectural choices, particularly the business architecture side of things, how architects can influence business choices in this area. And Chris Lockhart is also well known to those who've been following Architect Tomorrow, leader of the Consultant Saying Things podcast, and represents the other side of the Atlantic. So hopefully he's got thick skin today, because we know we might be throwing some interesting things his way to kind of give the US perhaps perspective on this stuff. So look, with that, let's get into the conversation. And what I'll kick off with is, so Bianca, we've thrown around quite a lot of terminology here already, which for many perhaps is alien. So can you talk to us a little bit about conscious capitalism and what kind of conscious capitalism is and triple bottom line?
My pleasure. And hi, everybody. I hope you're all having a great week. And thanks for sticking to us this late. So I'm just going to give a little bit of a high-level background of this discussion and why this conscious architectural choices link somehow with the conscious capitalism theory. So conscious capitalism is a philosophy developed by the founder of Whole Foods that believes businesses can succeed pursuing their profits in an ethical way, taking into account not only their shareholders, but also the overall stakeholders to the business. So that includes your customers, your suppliers, your employees, the community, the environment in general. And they should pursue not only short-term shareholder value, but the long journey. And just to put that into a bit of perspective, last year in August, you could see the CEOs of JP Morgan, IBM, and Johnson & Johnson coming to the cover of Fortune magazine to say shareholder value is no longer everything. So customers are all looking for something bigger than just companies pursuing profits. They need to see purpose. But for purposes to be true, it needs to reflect in the way you do business. So again, the way you relate to your customers, your suppliers, or employees, the impact you have on your community and the environment. So that's how this all links up to the idea of conscious architectural choices. So I think in the background, we've all been talking about conscious capitalism, but not naming it. And this is all why doing business in a more ethical way actually not only pays off, but it pays better, how these companies have been proving recently.
Thanks, Bianca. And so, Chris, I'm going to turn to you. Do you think that this is something that architects should already be thinking about? And are architects being lazy by not sort of thinking about the broader picture of the world? What's your take on this one? I think you may be on mute.
Sorry, I've never done a Zoom call before or a webinar. Sorry about that. Yeah, no, it was really interesting what I was saying. Sorry that it didn't get across. I think it's really interesting, right? Kind of a thing, because I think, look, if you go back and you look at the financial crisis and you looked at, people being let out of the office in handcuffs and things of that nature, right? I think there are certainly implications to business decisions, obviously, and they can hurt people, they can put people in jail, they can hurt our society, et cetera. And when you think about it, it's not the evil genius rubbing his hands together in the closet somewhere, like saying, I'm going to ruin the world. They're making decisions based on the information that they're getting from the people that know the information. And whether you call that an enterprise architect or a business architect or whatever architect, insert your name architect, oftentimes those are the people that have the information that is necessary for business decisions to be made, right? So I think there's something here, which is, are you the type of architect that's like, well, you know what, I know Oracle really well, so guess what? Every solution is going to be an Oracle solution, right? Or are you the type of architect that's like, what is the best thing to do in this particular use case, in this particular scenario? And even if I don't know the thing, can I help figure out what the answer is? And I think oftentimes, I glibly use the lazy label. I think oftentimes, people are like, well, I know this, so I already have a deck on this. I'll just change the title and here we go, right? I've got the lines in the boxes in a Visio diagram, just change the information and go. And I think there is some of that out there. And I think maybe it's just because, architecture is not really a true profession. Like lawyers or doctors, we're not licensed to be architects, right? And yet, think about the impact that an architect could have on a business decision, right? I mean, it's pretty big in my view. So I think it's something that people should, if you're in the architecture field, you should be doing just by routine. I think we've collectively gotten lazy over the years because, frankly, we're not really being held to account. You don't see the enterprise architect being walked out in handcuffs, right? That sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, the piece that springs to mind here around laziness is just throwing kind of computers at the problem. So for a long time, I think we've kind of treated compute and storage as cheap or free, nearly, and therefore we have perhaps just been quite, to the point we were just talking about, been a little bit lazy in how we choose to architect and design solutions for the business, and that's had a cost. I mean, Nathan and I spoke about debt. There's the concept of technical debt. I would argue there's the concept of environmental debt here as well. And perhaps if I can go next to Nathan and Gunnar to talk about this one. So Nathan, obviously you and I spoke about this, but what's your take on how much influence actually the architect has on this versus actually is it just sort of relaying the message and presenting options to the business? What's your take here on that sort of things? We're suffering from mute gremlins again.
Yeah. So if I maybe kind of give an example that I came across earlier the year. So there's a lot of exciting work being done around smart cities at the moment, and obviously from a triple bottom line perspective, and in terms of how it supports the number 11 goal around sustainable cities and communities, then a lot of those solutions on face value would be things that we as architects might look to include as part of a strategy or a roadmap. What's not always clear sometimes with those kind of pre-canned solutions, particularly if they're looking as part of their marketing play to associate themselves with one of the SDG goals, is that there are quite often things under the hood that you might not suspect or may not first think of. So the reason I mentioned smart cities is because currently smart cities and a lot of pre-canned solutions are actually holding proprietary technology standards that will down the line have serious interoperability challenges for those clients. And that doesn't become clear to those clients until they've already invested multiple hundreds of millions or billions of pounds, dollars, etc. So they've followed a path with absolutely the best of intentions from the sustainable goals perspective. But in terms of a 2x2 grid as an architect, we need to ensure that we're going in that top right grid of this fulfills those goals, but it's also good architecture. And not everything out there at the moment, it lives in that 2x2 grid.
And you mentioned triple bottom line there. So for those not familiar with that terms, I don't think we've explained, that's not just profit, but it's also people and planet, right? So
Yeah,
so,
that's
sort of
right.
coming on to
Yeah.
so Gunnar, we've spoken a bit about the kind of energy and waste sort of side of things. Is this something, in your experience working with customers, is this something that is on the radar for the architect, the kind of wider implications of their sort of technology and their architectural choices for their businesses? Or do you think this is still something that's kind of in a fairly immature state?
I think sustainability, and I hope you can hear me and I'm not on mute.
Yep.
Good. I think sustainability is clearly something that is high on the agenda, not just for our clients, but also for us or for me individually. And it's really surprising if you have a look at the sustainability footprint, and I refer here to mainly the CO2 footprint of ICT, so all of communication put together. And you need to look at the numbers, which are sometimes maybe surprising. All of ICT together contributes 3% to the CO2 globally. That's on par with aviation fuel in 2018. So all compute power we have across the globe generates exactly the same CO2 footprint as all the planes flying around the world. It's quite surprising, quite huge. If you were to put all ICT into a country, it would be the third largest in terms of electricity consumption.
Wow.
And just kind of to see kind of the unintended consequences of ICT, there was a video that was issued on YouTube that hit the first one that hit 5 billion views. And somebody calculated that the 5 billion views of YouTube video generates exactly or consumes exactly the same amount of electricity that's 40,000 US households in 1 year. So there's clearly kind of a responsibility, and you mentioned non-functional requirements before, a responsibility by us architects who are typically there to facilitate making the right choices, the right decisions. Exactly what Chris was saying around taking input and providing evidence and material to making the right choices. And clearly with the sustainability responsibility that we do have, we need to realize that we need to kind of be more, more sensitized to the fact that it consumes electricity, it generates or can have an impact on CO2 footprint.
I wonder, it's staggering, those numbers, and when you put it that way, it probably really puts into context. But I wonder if this is happening because as we've abstracted ourselves away, we've moved from physical machines to virtual machines, and then we've gone to cloud. The days of actually physically installing the actual equipment that our workloads as businesses are running on is kind of gone, right? It's kind of, I just log on to the console, I spin up a whole load of compute and provision storage. And it's almost like it's a computer game or something. It's not real,
When I started as an architect in a couple of years back in the 1990s, I used to work for a big Deutsche Bank, a German bank, and when you went, I spent probably most of my time in the data center. So I went typically every week because in those days you had to physically still be connected to the Windows server to install an application. You couldn't do it remotely. Weirdly, that sounds nowadays. There was no headless operation, so you had to be in the data center. And you saw the machines, you could smell them, generate a huge amount of heat. Nowadays, like you say, it's a bit more remote. You can operate, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands machines remotely. And I do think that, up until maybe 2 or 3 years back, it was only in pockets where sustainability was a key driver. I'll give you an example in the UK. For those of you who know the UK, there's an agency called Environment Agency that was always very in the forefront in government to thinking about sustainability back in 2006 or 2007 already, so it's 13 years ago. And when it came to transforming the IT, sustainability was a key objective, a key driver, a key principle. So whenever you as an architect design the solution in this context, you had to not just consider the things that you mentioned before, cost, quality, time, so delivery time, but also your CO2 footprint. Are you mitigating CO2? Are you reducing CO2? It was as important as the cost, as the quality. And I think unless and until that non-functional characteristic of sustainability is on par, then performance or reliability or quality or cost, it may not be in the forefront of when you're designing, because as an architect, of course, if you have different options, you have to prioritize which are the key criteria that I choose to make the right decision. And you have an arm's length of criteria, you will choose the key ones. And if sustainability isn't in the key ones, you may not make the right choices from a sustainability perspective.
That's a really nice pivot actually into the conversation I want to now have with Mina, which is, as Gunnar says, there's not always an incentive for people to kind of think about doing this. So clearly compliance and the law and legal frameworks and stuff will change. And I think for me, the interesting conversation we've had recently is, of course, there are heavily regulated industries already, and they already have, if you look at the financial services sector, which we perhaps won't talk about too much today, but we have on previous Architect Tomorrow conversations. If you look at the pharmaceuticals world and the kind of medical data and medical devices, all that sort of stuff, there's examples there of how regulation and so on can really steer people, and it really, people really kind of focus on that, right? I mean, that was a large part of your role at a large pharmaceutical, right?
Yeah, so having come from the healthcare industry, it's very regulated. But I think broadly what we want to advocate and what works better is not just a bit of stick, but also a bit of carrot. So I think the incentive is really important. And as Gunnar mentioned, sort of building that sustainability by design into what architects are doing and incentivizing that appropriately is a great idea. Of course, we're going to need some sort of oversight and regulation in order to make sure that things happen. But I think it's probably a good combination of the two. In the healthcare sector in particular, we often see a lot more social activism in our investors as well. So I think there will be a lot of incentive that comes from that kind of pressure as well to make sure that companies are not just thinking about the bottom line, but also what their contribution is to the broader society and the communities in which they operate. With regards to data, I mean, obviously it's gold, it's liquid gold for companies, and particularly in the health sector, we're dealing with highly sensitive information. So it's incumbent and imperative that architects are making sure that they're sort of putting themselves in the shoes of the individuals whose data they traffic in when thinking about how they're designing a particular product or system. Essentially trying to make sure that whatever protections and design controls that they're putting into place reflect what they would expect for their own health information, for example. But from a regulatory perspective, this is really tough because the regulations and regulators are not at all caught up with the latest technology. I'm barely hanging on as a lawyer. I'm licensed, but I'm not a technologist. So I'm barely keeping up myself. But there's lots of opportunities to work with regulators, for architects to educate regulators, which would be incredible, to create sandboxes where we can think about technology and social justice and social causes like the SDGs in a different way and collaboratively with the regulatory community, so that we can create a framework that actually works not only for the business, but for the customers, for the patients in my sector in particular.
Thanks, Mina. Well, let's stay with you for a moment, because I'm keen that we pivot to that data and privacy and kind of people impact. We've kind of touched on the kind of planetary kind of sustainability piece, but I'm keen that we talk about kind of data and protecting, because ultimately, if you look at the world, where the world's going now, in the West, this kind of drive to digitally transform and move things online, is only increasing, right? And certainly for the next sort of 6 months to a year, depending on what happens with vaccines and so on and so forth, clearly there will increasingly be telemedicine, there will be more track and trace. So what are the things that you're kind of seeing in the kind of health sort of sector that perhaps are interesting for us to kind of discuss around kind of the implications that has for like privacy and data side of things?
Absolutely. So I think broadly in the healthcare sector, what you're seeing is a shift from historically the healthcare provider or a payer being at the center of the health ecosystem, as opposed to where we're headed, or where some might argue we already are. The patient is actually at the center of the health ecosystem, and they themselves are generating their own health data through any number of technologies. The Apple Watch, Fitbit, those are probably the most ubiquitous, but there are lots of others. Insertables, ingestibles, there's lots of other things on the horizon are already in play, where technology is sort of rapidly helping individuals generate and understand their own health. They're becoming the CEOs of their own body. And where is that information going, and how is it being used? And I think, interestingly enough, just a few days ago in the FT, there was an article about Inrupt, which is the company where Tim Berners-Lee is the CTO, where they are trying to democratize people's information and create what they're calling pods, where I would be able to control my own information and control access. And interestingly enough, in this day and age, they have the BBC signed up for a pilot. They have NatWest, the large bank here in the UK, already signed up. But the reason it came up again in the FT is because they've just recently signed up the NHS. And those of us that are sort of, living in this insane time of a global pandemic, where governments and private companies, be it vaccine manufacturers or, distribution capabilities, are desperately trying to track and trace. And people are, want to be part of a global solution and part of a community that helps get this pandemic under control. But there are real questions and ethical issues around what is that data being used for after this pandemic is in our rearview mirror? What happens to that information? We've seen time and time again, governments and companies alike use that information in a way that is questionable at best. And so as we as architects, sort of think about how they build these technologies, initially with Facebook, good intended use, that's probably a controversial statement, but all these things that start with like a benign and charitable perspective inevitably can be weaponized. And how do we make sure that as we think about the use cases, we are also mitigating against the misuse cases?
You've beautifully lined us up to talk about social, which was where I wanted to go next. So thank you for that. And also, for those that have been on this call since the beginning, the first conversation was from an author of a book about Facebook and kind of how it kind of evolved and so on and so forth. So for those who have access to the recording and didn't see, that's well worth checking out. A really interesting conversation about Facebook. But Bianca, I wanted to kind of talk to you about the social media stuff that we were talking about. The kind of, in fact, all of you, I think I've used the phrase darker side of digital with, right? I mean, if I haven't, then hopefully you'll kind of follow where I'm going when Bianca and I talk about this next piece. So, if you look at kind of social media, and as Mina said, it's started off with the best of intentions, connecting people, sharing cat pictures, all very innocent, and then before you know it, it's becoming highly addictive. It's drawing users in. Arguably elections are being sort of distorted or influenced heavily by programmatic advertising and all this sort of stuff, which and I know you and I were talking about kind of the impact it's perhaps having on the younger generation. I don't want to sound like a boring sort of dad here, which I am these days, but for most of us on this panel, we've grown up before the ubiquitous computing and ubiquitous internet access. But I know, Bianca, we were talking about kind of observing sort of traits and trends in the younger generation and kind of how perhaps that's a little bit scary, right?
Absolutely. It's interesting to see exactly how you were touching that, Oliver, that growing up before social media, it means if it affects you in a different way. You're able to see what is fake, what's not, what is pre-designed, to make people feel that in a certain way. Whilst the new generation, for them, this is life. This is how they interact with each other. This is how they demonstrate they like something their friend did or not. And also, I believe this is actually tailoring a bit of the behavior of them towards knowledge. I find it so interesting that growing up, information was so difficult to find, and you were so happy when you found like that little book you were looking for on the topic you wanted to read about in the library. And nowadays you can literally Google anything. You can find any sort of information you'd like, but still, people's instinct to do so is every time smaller, I think. So I think with the new generation, because they have everything so easily, and because these things, the social media keeps us so addicted to just the infinite rolling of information that comes to you naturally. When you have to work hard to actually get that information, they don't have that instinct anymore. It's taken out of them. Things have to come automatically. They have to pop on the screen. They lost the will to look for it and the joy of finding it. I don't know, perhaps it's my take.
I think it comes back to the laziness, I think, that Chris and I were sort of starting off with around, we could accuse architects of being lazy, maybe not kind of thinking through the implications of what they're doing, but equally, I think a lot of user interface design, a lot of user experience design is preying on people's laziness. If it's not their laziness, it's other kind of characteristics. So look, I will open up now to the group. I'll be less pointing at people and allow perhaps a bit more of a free for all until I have to shut that down. So Mina, you wanted to speak, so go for it.
Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to reflect on Bianca. Sort of the yang. If that's the yang of that is sort of found in the SDG number 9. Around industry, innovation, and infrastructure, in particular infrastructure, and making sure that, yes, there is definitely a generation in the West and in the Far East that has an enormous amount of access to information. And what does that do to their attention span and their ability to be social human beings and all of those concerns and things like that. But equally, I think there's a concern in those places in the least developing countries where the infrastructure doesn't actually exist and that people are actually disadvantaged by not having access to ready access to information in the same way, such that they are sometimes manipulated by their government, for example, into believing one thing when actually something else is true, and they're not able to verify any kind of information other than from the one source. And so I think just bringing it back to the SDGs, I think that sort of infrastructure creates and exacerbates SDG 10 around inequalities. And I think it's just something an architect can keep in mind when they're thinking about, open source. Who's it really open to?
Yeah, I think you've touched on a really good point around trade-offs and balancing. I think the good architect is able to kind of weigh things up. And I'm not suggesting that the Sustainable Development Goals should outweigh all the other considerations. It's of course a balanced conversation. The triple bottom line still has profit in it, right? So it's not just all about being, turning hippie-ish and kind of going, right, we won't make any money, but we'll be really good to the planet and society. It's got to be a balance. But I would say the pendulum has swung probably too far towards short-termism and short-term exploitation of people and planet when it needs to kind of reset. Clearly, we're now probably out of the pandemic going to have these green recovery investment sort of schemes like we've heard announced in the UK, and it may well swing slightly to the other side in order to kind of rebalance where we have a society that's living within its means. And I think it's the architect's role to kind of weigh up those trade-offs and present them to the businesses that are working with. Who wants? I see Chris, you're itching to say. Go on, go Chris.
Well, no, I mean, we're all getting along here so well, right? And agreeing with each other. So I'll throw the wrench in, right? I'll take issue with something Mina said a little bit earlier, and Bianca, you're next. I think look, maybe I'm a little bit Hobbesian or something, but like, I'm not so sure that, Zuckerberg sat in his dorm at Harvard and thought, what can I do for the good of the world to connect people, right? I mean, we've all seen the movie. We know what his motivation was, right? This wasn't like, the Garden of Eden that was corrupted. These things started out.
It's SDG number 5, gender equality, I think is the one you're looking for.
There you go. Thank you for bringing up that SDG. No, I mean, look, I think and this goes to people as well, right? It's the perceived self-interest kind of motivator that I think, if you're talking about pendulums, Oliver, it's like, maybe in the Western world, we've allowed the pursuit of perceived self-interest to sort of overwhelm a lot of things. I'll give you an example, right? Google. I love Google. I've always loved Google. I love the fact that I can be in the financial district in Manhattan and Google tells me, oh, by the way, your flight is leaving out of LaGuardia at such and such a time. And if you want to make it, you need to leave at this point in time to get there based on the traffic between here and there. And it's like, holy crap. I didn't tell Google about my flight. I didn't tell it where, all of these things. well, of course, you've permitted it access to Gmail and all these different things. That's an extremely useful piece of technology. Flip it to the dark side. Why is Google doing that? Is it to help me get to the airport? Or is it, right, hey, maybe you need to rent a car. Maybe, it's the ad platform, right? It's all of those things that go with it. So I'm not so sure that all of these things started out in altruistic sort of like, let's benefit humanity. I firmly believe a lot of them are like, how can I profit the most off of what I know about Mina's daily routine? And if to the extent that that's mutually beneficial for Mina and for Google, great. Where we've gone off the rails, right, is now where it's like Google is like, listening to your conversations and, well, we've probably all had those experiences where you're having a conversation with your significant other and suddenly Instagram starts showing ads for the thing that you were talking about or things that are related to it. Maybe that's useful, maybe it's not, right? But anyway, and then, I think, so this whole idea of, laziness, I'll refer to episode 23 of Star Trek, the original series in 1967. This is the one where Captain Kirk finds a planet where they conduct war by automated computer, right? And the computer basically just says, oh, you have to send 1 million people into the incinerator because it's, that's what the algorithm says. And the laziness bit is, look, I find Alexa useful, but if I'm relying on Alexa to turn the thermostat down when it's really, I just got to get my butt up and walk over and turn it down, we begin to get into this scenario of like, at what point is it too lazy? And I think that bleeds into personal choices in our automated lives, and it bleeds into architectural decisions when it comes to, user experience and things of that nature, right? I mean, honestly, do we really, who has used the automated IVRs when you call the airline, right? Hello, thank you for calling United Airlines. Blah, 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 blah. And then it doesn't understand anything you're saying because you're in the airport when you're trying to talk to it and it can't hear or understand. And I just want a person, right? I want a person. I mean, there are places and points in time, I guess, for automation. And I think, to use it to run our lives is the height of laziness, and to allow ourselves to make decisions, business decisions, based on what seems to be the easiest way to go. Bad choice, I think. And it bleeds over into all of the great icons you had in that slide, right, Oliver? It can impact every one of those things, the environment, people's lives, etc.
So you have to pay the fine for bringing up Star Trek or some science fiction.
Oh, do I? Were we not allowed to say that?
I'm just messing, but I know another big fan of sci-fi is Nathan, and Nathan and I have kind of spoken about, kind of various sci-fi writers kind of predicting the kind of the future. And so Nathan, I mean, do you think if architects don't advise their organizations effectively, we are headed for some kind of sci-fi style dystopia in a few years' time? What's your what sci-fi book do you think, or movie do you think we're headed towards at the moment?
I don't think it's so much heading towards. I think we're there. I think that. So I wonder, just in relation to something that Chris was saying about laziness, I wonder whether, to what degree, it may be more accurate to say that it's dilution of attention. That in what is really an attention economy, where the big tech giants are basically, I think the phrase is tobacco farmers with T-shirts. They are basically selling dopamine rushes for every notification that arrives on your device. And so the biggest challenge I find, and this isn't just with my children, it's also members of the C-suite, where I find there's actually quite a strong intersecting set between those two, is that dilution of attention span. And so in terms of then what you might be able to do towards it, I think where the Sustainable Development Goals are very useful is if you can look to tie those into your corporate plan, your corporate ethics, and then effectively highlight for decision makers the different perspectives of the optionality you as an architect might present in front of them. Because I think, to Gunnar's point earlier, what we're starting to see is is some of the measures that were quite low weighted, maybe a decade or two ago, they were there, but they were kind of very much kind of in the footnote category. Now that weighting has changed, and I'm not sure necessarily that all decision makers have necessarily caught up with that, or whether or not architects are doing everything they can to help to inform those decision makers on how those weightings around optionality have changed.
We did a research. We asked 7,500 customers in the retail space and 750 large organizations. That research was just issued a couple of weeks back. We asked them all sorts of different questions around consumer behavior. So what is your choices when you're buying a product? You know, what criteria do you apply to decide where do you go to buy a product? And what's really fascinating, and has shifted a lot over the last 18 months, was 80% of the consumers want to be able to make a difference in saving the planet for future generations. So 80% of the people, the customers of your clients, Nathan, that you just referred to, they want to see that your organization or the organization is making a difference. 72% of the customers that were interviewed said they're personally concerned about their environmental footprint. So there is inevitably a shift happening, and this is from the consumer side. So if the consumers are deciding now where they want to buy their products, the companies who are delivering these products, and indirectly the IT solutions that are supporting this, because IT is now the business, has to have sustainability as a core element, because otherwise you may not be able to sell your products.
Yeah. So certainly, Gunnar, from a B2C perspective, if your company's model's B2C, then I think increasingly you have no choice but to speak directly to the Sustainable Development Goals. I think even on a B2B level, what I'm seeing is a slightly different, the same pressure, but I'm seeing it coming from a different angle. I'm seeing it coming from things like triple bottom line accounting. So where you're getting accounting standards that are starting to shift, companies then are being told that they have to restructure their cost lines within their P&Ls to now match to new accounting standards. And that's then driving internal change within more B2B organizations, because now suddenly the CFO is very interested in this because it's directly impacting the P&L. And then that has a cascade effect in terms of those cost structures impacting your business model or your operating model.
Yeah, so the frustration for me is I think that technology has the amazing capability to help guide consumers on making sort of conscious choices, right? Going back to the sort of thing I opened with about individual choices, because if it can pick up the fact that you're talking to your significant other, as Chris was saying, that you might be interested in a particular brand of, I don't know, sports clothing or whatever it might be, it can equally also kind of help work out, you know, what the environmental footprint is of various different brands and steer you towards, you know, I've kind of had this sort of thought in the back of my mind around something called product radar, which essentially you would set your preferences as an individual. Like I want to kind of minimize carbon, or I want to kind of, you know, and I appreciate it's not a one-dimensional thing. There is a whole load of things on that Sustainable Development Goals piece around sort of modern slavery and various other things. But if you were able to kind of consciously say, right, this is the bar that I'm going to set, you know, perhaps you know, perhaps not everyone can set that same bar because there's a cost implication. But I guess what I'm getting at is, it feels to me like it's within the realms of possibility with technology today to help businesses and consumers kind of select things more intelligently, right?
Go to a retailer where when you buy a fridge or a freezer anywhere, probably in Europe or in the Western world, and you have a labeling from A very down to E, you know exactly. If I go somewhere, I don't make a selection anymore on the market or the brand. It needs to be A star. So it's A star. Then I have a look. Okay, what capability does it have? What does it give me? And then I have a look. Okay, which brand is it? Is it a German brand? I'll buy it. Good quality. And it should be the same for IT. why don't we have this for IT? Why don't I know when I watch Netflix or Amazon or anything online what the CO2 footprint of that streaming service is? Why don't I have that with other IT services? And I think you'll see soon, maybe, a much easier categorization for consumers like us to make a decision based on CO2 footprint, as an example.
Yeah.
But I'm also interested, that's sort of the explicit, how do I make an explicit choice? So labeling, how can I compare A and B and what the social impact is, environmental or otherwise. There's also sort of the implicit, more nudge theory, which might be slightly more controversial around can we create choices within technology that nudge people towards sustainability, in its broadest term, and they have to opt out almost. You have to make an explicit decision to do something different. So in sort of employing sort of psychological nudge theory to technology to get people to change behaviors or to, because all of us sort of go with the preferences and the default settings on so many things. Why can't those be sustainable to begin with, potentially?
Bianca, I was going to kind of come to you and ask about what you're seeing on your kind of MBA program around, because I know you're lucky and you have one of your professors is kind of involved in WEF and things like that. Do you think this is kind of registering, what's your kind of take on kind of these choices that everyone makes at the business level and individual level? Do you think that's kind of coming through in the MBA piece that you're kind of looking at the moment?
Absolutely, because majority of the companies are actually coming to the conclusion that doing business more sustainably pays better. Mm-hmm. Consumers are, every time, like we just mentioned, every time we're willing to pay the premium for more sustainable products. I think the fact is that we're all pretty much new to that reality and trying to increase our knowledge and understand how we can have a greater impact, but we're still figuring out in certain parts of the world and certain areas of our life, how can we have a greater impact. You might know about the impact of your car, you might know about the impact of your commute, but you might not know about the impact of your hardware or the impact of other parts of your life and the sustainability in general. But it's been proven by research, and I think Gunnar went in a similar way around with his research, that consumers are willing to pay the premium for a more sustainable product. So businesses can benefit from that. Actually, a great example in the industry that set the bar really high for other companies was Unilever. Unilever invested massively in transforming their supply chain to incorporating more sustainable production processes, reducing things like water and making products more concentrate to decrease the consumption in their plants. And they set the bar really high for the industry after that. And the reaction was pretty bad when he implemented those changes in the company. Of course, shareholder value decreased, and there was a lot of resistance and a lot of pressure to turn things backwards. But once this became established in the market and consumers came turning to Unilever for these more sustainable products and the profits level up again, now they're basically the best in practice in the market. That's what everyone looks up to when they're looking to do business sustainably and how they can transform their supply chains.
So let's move on to a topic I know we've all discussed before, but let's share it with the audience around AI. So I mean, Chris kind of knocked people being lazy for using their assistants, but I mean, I've touched on the fact that maybe part of the answer is Alexa helps you make kind of informed choices, and maybe architects need some kind of, I don't know, Babel fish that translates between all the various different sort of sustainable development goals and what choice is sensible. But I know a lot of us have got strong opinions on kind of AI and its role kind of moving forwards, but clearly there are challenges with AI today. Like there is bias in the coming through from the data that's fed into the AI, and clearly that can kind of impact the other SDGs that we've just been talking about. But what, Mina, I know there's some interesting healthcare examples, isn't there, of AI, and what's kind of stood out for you as an interesting kind of discussion around the use of AI in the health sector?
So far in the health sector, I think reflecting on what Chris said about sometimes you just want a person. I think in the health context in particular, healthcare professionals are still very much thought of as trusted professionals that people actually want to interact with, as opposed to perhaps a bank teller. So I think the role of AI in healthcare, I think, is primarily to augment and support decision making. One of the best examples I've seen is out here in the UK, a company called Chiron Medical, who is utilizing AI technology to read mammograms. Now, the standard in the UK for a mammogram to be read is that 2 radiologists have to look at the same scan to ensure that nothing is missed. And what they're doing and the way they're deploying Chiron is replacing one of those human radiologists with the AI technology. To me, this is an exceptional example of a great use of AI and how it can make humans more efficient. There are definitely cases where the AI has found things that the human eye has not been able to see looking at the scan, but the judgment and the treatment decision and the conversation with the patient comes back to the human. Some of the other areas that are antiquated in the sense that AI wasn't even contemplated with the US HIPAA law, Chris, was developed and created, but still within the HIPAA law in the US, which covers health privacy specifically, there is a section in there about having automated decisions be reviewed by humans if there is a significant impact to a patient and their health. And so I think there's a balance. I think in healthcare, you can definitely have, there's definitely a role for AI that not only improves and enhances care, but there is a cautionary tale there to, again, make sure that it's not misused or that we don't rely on it perhaps entirely at its current stage to make decisions about life and death.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got a couple more minutes perhaps, and then we'll give the audience a chance to ask us some questions. But I mean, Chris, maybe on this one, kind of tying back to sort of what we talked about before, which is kind of misinformation and, again, sort of perhaps being careful of people's laziness to kind of have information come to them rather than going and seeking it out. But what's your kind of thoughts on the danger of AI and the considerations architects perhaps and businesses need to make around AI not misleading its users? So the kind of, again, the darker side of AI maybe of kind of, confusing the audience.
Yeah, I mean, the singularity is coming, Oliver, right? Beware the singularity. So, I mean, just what I was thinking, I mean, in all these discussions, I know I can go on for a while, so I'll try to keep it brief. I think it's really, it's less about like architects are lazy or people are lazy because they use Alexa. It's more about the fact whether that Facebook is good or bad or not or whatever. It's more about the fact that these capabilities that are designed and implemented by architects like us, right? And these capabilities that are deployed, much like any technology, can be used for good or ill, right? And I think we all sort of assumed it was for good. I want to be able to put my photos in the cloud and have it automatically tag everyone that is this person or every dog or whatever. But I don't think anyone really. I mean, because it was cool, it works, it's great, that's awesome. Yeah. But did anyone ever ask the question like, well, what's Google doing with that information? They're not just doing it so that it's easy for you, right? They're using that for some purpose, right? And I think we're not asking those questions. We're not asking those questions when we design things. We're doing stuff because it's cool, because it's awesome, because we can, and that's sort of where I'm going. I think it's the double-edged sword of the capabilities that we're talking about here. AI can be used for great good. It can also destroy humanity, right? So let's get somewhere on that, in the balance there, somewhere in the middle. That would be great.
Can I just step in there on the on the cool and awesome front? So one of the things that DARPA's been struggling on has been trying to develop fully automated weapon systems, which is kind of scary as a concept. But as an architect, it's been quite interesting because what's happened is they've got a certain sort of stage of the way quite far in, and then they've suddenly realized that they don't actually understand fully how the machine learning and AI algorithms work. And they found that through basically significant failures in their testing. And what that's forced then DARPA to do is take a step back and go, oh, okay, we actually need to step back and strip this back, and now we have to start investing a lot of money and research into something called explainable AI. So this is basically taking those machine learning and AI algorithms and basically fully interrogating and documenting what exactly each one of them does, and going through a much more rigorous testing process, because the realization was clear that where they thought they were 90% of the way there, they didn't actually fully understand what it was that they created, and therefore they couldn't actually get that extra 10%, and weren't going to for a number of years.
Yeah. Look, I'm conscious we could kind of go on about AI for some time, so it was a bit risky of me to kind of bring it up. So, Michael, perhaps I could ask, have we had any kind of questions coming through while we've been talking, or perhaps we want to open up to questions at this point?
Yeah, no questions yet. Well, as soon as I said that, we do have a question. It's quite lengthy.
Okay.
Let's see. To Bianca's point, Unilever received a lot of pressure from their shareholders when turning their operations more sustainable, thinking it would be massive loss of profits. Do other companies still suffer from shareholders having this mindset? And do you think this traditional thinking gives opportunities for younger companies and architects to make the market share with more sustainable solutions?
Absolutely. Actually, I think a lot of the hype around sustainability was first generated in San Francisco, in California, with the new startups, and how they very vocably communicated their concerns about not only their company, how they're impacting the society, how they're giving back. And we have loads of examples of other big companies that tried to jump on the bus but didn't really work well. Like PepsiCo tried to do a similar transformation as Unilever. PepsiCo CEO pulled the plug, actually, with the risk of losing her job. So I think there's lots of other companies trying to transform their models of fitting to the new standards, but not really being able to change the mindset. Well, if the mindset of their shareholders doesn't really allow for this room for change, it's very difficult. And it's initially a very risky move. It proves to pay off over the long journey, but you have to hold tight for this long journey. And many companies don't really manage to make it.
I think that the investment firms are waking up. Like, you look at BlackRock, it's well worth looking at BlackRock's website and publications about sort of investing for the long term. I think pension funds and longer term investors are very much looking at sustainability in their portfolios, and you've got kind of the Bank of England and others kind of looking at, we've touched on reporting, environmental reporting for large firms, but I certainly think the tide is changing on shareholder and
look at government regulation.
Sorry, go on, Gunnar.
Just one point before Mina goes in. We only have 2 minutes left. Just look at government regulations. Look at what's happening in different countries in terms of net zero targets. We just announced in the UK, 2030, you can't buy a diesel or petrol car, a new one, of course. And it's pulled forward. And you'll see that accelerating, particularly in Europe, I think, and in other regions as well. Sorry, Nina, go on.
No. That's great. You're making my point for me, Gunnar. I was just going to say that in the private sector, I often think of pharmaceutical companies as the last bastion of disruption and change. But even my old CEO, Emma Walmsley of GSK, has just recently come out and made commitments around environmental sustainability on behalf of GSK. And I think investors are definitely putting more pressure on. There's a lot more visibility on these sustainability indexes and where you fall from a company perspective. And while Unilever and Paul Pullman definitely started and led the way, there are lots of other big companies coming through with that pressure. The automotive industry, the beverage industry, Diageo, take a lot of water to make a pint of beer, it turns out. And so they are having to, really reflect on and face into what their sustainable impacts are. And I think the shareholders are moving with them more and more.
Cool. So look, I'm conscious we've got 1 minute left, and so Michael will probably be telling us off. So look, firstly, thank you, everybody. I appreciate you all joining the panel, and hopefully this has been really interesting for the attendees. Certainly, I've found everyone's perspectives interesting. If folks are interested in this, that there are conversations I've recorded with all the panelists, or will do over the next few days. So look out on the Architect tomorrow. go and subscribe to the channel, and you can find more kind of thoughts on this topic. And by all means, kind of come and join us, join the dialogue. The LinkedIn group is very much there for us to kind of talk and discuss with the wider community of architects. So thanks again, everyone, and look forward to continuing the conversation on the Architect Tomorrow community.
And thank you, Oliver.
Thank you.